Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my most disappointing reads of 2022. And this is a video I always debate filming. In fact, the past couple of years, I actually filmed like my worst or most disappointing reads of the year, and then I never posted it. And a lot of that is just because I don't like to be super negative or post a video that's just all negative. But when I think about me and what I enjoy watching, I get a lot of value from a negative review. And I often get more out of a negative review than I do a positive one in terms of recommendations. And there are some booktubers who I'll watch their worst books of the year and get recommendations from that because we don't have the same reading tastes in common. So I'm calling this most disappointing because I really don't think any of these books are bad. I don't think there is an objectively bad book out there, though there is one I'm going to talk about that I really do think needed a lot of work. And if I'm being honest, it's the closest I've ever come to seeing something that I think is objectively a bad book. And so we can talk about that. I would say that's probably my worst book of the year. But I'm calling these disappointing because I went into them with certain expectations that weren't met. And a lot of that's due to me. That's not due to the book. But some of these I just really struggled with. So let's go on and get into it. And I think I want to go with the one that's most controversial first. This book is actually a DNF. And I made it 250 pages through this before I really had to sit it down. I don't often put DNFs on lists like this. I don't often review DNFs because a lot of times I DNF a book for various reasons. Some of it is I just put the book down and I forget that I was reading it. Sometimes I just know I'm not in the mood for it. I very rarely DNF knowing that I will not come back to the book. And I actually feel like in this case, I probably am not going to come back to it. That's Demons by Dostoevsky. And I'm telling you, people came out of the woodwork, got all over me when I DNF'd this, when I said that I DNF'd it in a vlog a couple of months ago. People told me that I had the wrong translation. People told me that I should listen to it on audiobook. People told me that I didn't give it long enough to take off. People told me that I just didn't understand it. I got almost halfway through this, y'all, before I called it quits. I gave it my all. I gave it everything. I read this on reading sprints. I tried. I really tried, and it just wasn't for me. This book is so not for me, and I don't think the translation has anything to do with it because I've seen a lot of people really love this translation. I think at its heart, I thought this book was going to be more political and more serious, and yet there is a very comic tone to the majority of it that doesn't play very well for me, but I can understand that it probably would work well for others. This is definitely a case of I just didn't know what the book was when I went into it, and I thought it was something else than what it actually is. But this one, I am just so confused by, and I constantly think about this. Whenever I think about this book, I was reading a book last year this time called The Plotters by Eun-Soo Kim. I remember it like it was yesterday. And the main character of that book was an assassin, but he loved to read. And he was reading this at one time, and he was just complaining about how absolutely boring it was and how he just didn't get on with it, how he didn't really like it. And somebody said, why don't you just put the book down? Like, why are you even reading it if you don't like it? And he just said, well, I read to entertain myself. Some people watch TV at night. For me, I like to read, and so I'm just going to read it to the conclusion. And I thought, well, you know, I don't have to read it to the conclusion, so I put it down. But I always think about that guy, that he had the same struggles with this book that I did. I'm happier for DNFing it, but this really disappointed me as I honestly thought this would probably be my favorite Dostoevsky. There's no way this competes with The Idiot, and there's no way this competes with even something like Notes from Underground. This was just 100% not for me. You can try to convince me in the comments to come back to it. You can tell me a different translation, but I'm telling y'all, I really don't think I'm going to come back to this. I really hope I do, and I hope I'm wrong. I hope I just wasn't ready to read it. And so when I come back to it, I'll be in the right headspace. But boy, this one was probably my major disappointment of the year in terms of going into it with the highest hopes. I want to talk about something else that's controversial, and that's Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. I cannot tell you how many years Pachinko has been on my radar, and I just said, this is the year for it because they were adapting this into a television show, and so I really wanted to read this before I watched the television show, and this book is one that genuinely confused me, and I always hate to be like this. I hate to be the odd man out. I really want to understand what everyone is talking about. When a book gets really popular, that's exciting to me, and I want to be part of the conversation, and I always hate if I don't get on with that book. I remember right when I was picking this up, Jen from Insert Literary Pun here posted her review of this on Goodreads, and she didn't like it at all. And I thought, that bodes ill for me because I tend to agree with Jen on a lot of stuff. And so I wondered about that going into this, and what didn't work for me with Pachinko was I think its writing was very clipped. So it felt like we could just kind of jolted from scene to scene. We just moved from one thing to another without much in terms of exposition and without us really even getting an understanding of why the characters felt the way that they did. She would just be like, oh, this character is crying because so-and-so spoke to her. Why? Why? I don't know. It wasn't explained. There was no exposition. There was nothing from that character's perspective in their head that gave us a clue as to why that upset her. And that was what was really frustrating to me about it. But I have to say, one thing that I didn't like about this is actually a mark of positivity for the book. The one character that I was invested in, I thought the author did so dirty. And I can tell that's probably the point of Pachinko. But when I finished this book, I was absolutely enraged at what happened to him. I mean, absolutely enraged. And that's actually a mark of positivity to the book, that I had that visceral a reaction to it. But he was the only character in the narrative that I felt was fully fledged, that I felt had a true personality, and he's the only one whose motivations I understood. And I think a lot of that was not that we were in his head, not that we were really getting his perspective on anything, but it was that from the outside, I knew the perspective of his life. I knew everything that had happened in his life. And so how he acted made sense to me, even if I never got his internal monologue. To me, that was the fault of the book. I never knew what the characters were thinking or why they acted in certain ways in certain situations. I learned a lot from Pachinko. And in fact, Pachinko really helped me one day at my job. I think about this a lot because we had a Korean-American researcher, and he was speaking to me specifically about the relationship between South Korea and Japan. And because of Pachinko, I had gone down the rabbit hole and learned everything about 1930s South Korea and Japan relations. And so I had a lot to tell him, and I felt pretty good about that. So I do have to thank Pachinko for that. But on the whole, this was weirdly written. And it really confused me that this one was such an awards darling, that this is one that people really took to. I really was confused on reading this as to why this one was the most popular, why this is the one that took off. And I think on the whole, the book had a melodramatic quality that made it seem unrealistic to me. And that's a shame because the book was talking about actual hardships and things that people really went through. And yet that kind of melodramatic soap opera quality made me feel like the book was just taking things too far. And I don't think it really was. I guess at the end of the day, there was just a tone to the writing that I didn't like. I think that's probably what my issue with this was. But I am so happy for the people who loved this. I really wish that I had been one of them, but I really went on a roller coaster ride with this book, and it wasn't a fun one. Another classic that was a bit of a disappointment to me, but not bad. I didn't rate this book poorly the way that I have the others on this list, but that's Electra by Euripides. And I reread this earlier this year. Normally, I wouldn't include a reread on any end-of-year stats or end-of-year lists, but this was just such a different experience to the first time I read this work that I feel like I need to include it here. I originally rated this 5 stars. And when I reread it, I was constantly asking myself, how did I rate this 5 stars the first time I read it? Because I think it really is truly like a 2.5 star, 3 star, truly middle of the road classic work. I have an entire video where I really talk through my feelings on this one. And so maybe I should just keep this short, but this to me was just so disappointing because I remember having such a great love for it when I was younger, specifically when I was a teenager. And I don't know if that speaks to how I have changed as a reader, that my tastes have changed, that I'm interested in different things, or if this was maybe one of my first forays into classical literature and I was just so blown away by that and so excited by that as a teen that I would have rated this more highly at the time. And yet once I read more, I probably would have always thought this was more mediocre than some other classical Greek plays. I read this with Rainey, whose channel I will link to down below, and we both had kind of a middling perspective on this. This book wasn't bad, but I think we were both kind of disappointed by it. I think we went into it expecting something really great because this is Euripides, but this is not one of his more talked about plays. And upon finishing it, I think we both understood why. So sadly, this was a disappointment to me and I dropped my rating from 5 stars to 3. I think this book is truly like a true 2.5 star. I do think it is perfectly middle of the road. It's not great, but it's not bad. But to me, on the whole, thinking about the reading experience of this one, this is one of my biggest disappointments of the year, sadly enough. Let's talk about a book that I just finished. That's why I wait till the end of the year to film these videos, because something always happens for me in the last week of December, both positively and negatively. So a book that was a pretty big disappointment to me here in the last week of the year has been Patricia Wants to Cuddle. And you may say, just from the title alone, from the cover alone, that you would know this book is not going to work for me. And I should have known that. But this is kind of a literary horror type book that is following a Bachelor-esque show where the finale of the show is being set on some secluded island in the Pacific Northwest. And strange things start happening to the contestants once they get there. And I think on the whole, that premise sounds interesting, and this is the perfect example of a disappointing read to me, because the idea was there. This could have been really good, and I just wanted more from it. I think the concept of this book was very strong, and I think there was a campiness to the idea alone that the author did not really lean into, but I personally believe would have made the book stronger. I wound up rating this 2 stars. I felt like that was generous. I didn't mind the writing in this. The characterization was pretty poor in my opinion, and it took a long time for this book to get going. Once it finally leaned into the horror elements, we were over halfway through the book. And I thought, if I didn't know what this book was about, I would not have had any motivation to get through that first half. And I think this is a book that is spoiled by how it has been described, by how it has been marketed. If you read the description for this book, you know exactly what's going on the island from that alone. And so the mystery of the book and the mystery of you trying to figure out what's happening to people, that's been robbed from you if you have just read the description of the book. So I think that was a pretty weird choice on the part of the publisher. The book was weird, and that's not really why I rated it low. I personally love a weird book, but there were elements to this that I just think could have been so much stronger. And I think the book just would have been more fun if it had allowed itself to be campy. I think the concept of this was just so funny, and the author never once allowed it to go there, and I think the book would have been stronger if they had. So this is one that I'm glad I took a chance on. Like, I'm glad I stepped out of my comfort zone to read it, but it was very disappointing to me. As many of you know at this point, I themed my year of reading this year around books that K-pop idols had recommended. And there were a lot of hits for me from this project, but there were a lot of misses too. And I think the biggest miss is one that I didn't actually DNF. I DNF'd a lot of books for this project that I never talked about on my channel, and I'm glad for that. But one of the books I finished to completion, I hate to say was a disappointment because it was recommended by my favorite K-pop idol, my ultimate bias in K-pop. That's Momo by Ende. So this was the basis for Suho from EXO, who is my old bias. I just love him to death. This was the basis for his album that came out this year. The songs were constructed around themes in this book. Everything about the music videos that he put out was also in conversation with concepts from this book. And one thing I will say positive for this experience is that the concepts and the ideas behind this novel were very, very strong, and they were far more interesting than the plot. I think this was quite philosophical, and that was its strong suit. To me, there was a lot to discuss kind of underlying in terms of theme, but in terms of just reading this book to enjoy it, it was very slow, and it felt quite pointless to me in places. And this is a middle grade book. This is a middle grade book that was originally written in German. So part of me wonders, did I just get a poor translation of this? But I also just think in general, middle grade is not for me. And I hate to say that about an entire age range of fiction, but I truly don't think it's for me. I think I missed the boat on it. And I think even if I had been reading this at the target age, I probably would have had the same issue with it, because I think the themes and the concepts of it would have passed me over. Momo is about a girl who lives in kind of an Italianate style city, which sounds incredible. And it is about these men in gray suits who come into town and essentially start stealing time from people. And that's so fascinating. I mean, that's really interesting. As I said, to me, the ideas behind this were so fascinating. And there was a lot to discuss here, and I can see why an artist would latch onto this book as inspiration for their own art. It's not a shock to me that a lot of K-pop idols love this book, and it's not a shock to me that someone like Suho would write songs about it, because I do think thematically it had a lot to say. But in terms of just trying to read a book to enjoy it, which is what I was doing, I didn't feel like it had a lot going on. I felt like it really dragged. This was another book that I think is pretty middle of the road. I would not say this is a bad book. I would not tell you not to pick it up. But I certainly went into this with the expectation that I was going to rate it at least 4 stars, if not 5. And that most certainly did not happen. This is definitely one of my more disappointing entries this year. And I'm sad about that. I do think this is a book I could see myself returning to. And I think it would just be fun to write an essay on it. You can see I tabbed it. I mean, I had a great time annotating it and analyzing the music videos and stuff that Suho put out and all of the art that he put out. It was a really fun reading experience for that. But if I am just judging the book as a book, if I had just picked this up on a whim, I think there was a lot about it that I would have wanted changed. I don't think it was very pacey to be a middle grade. And so it just felt very slow to me, unfortunately. So this is sadly one of my most disappointing books of the year. Let's talk about Hester. This is a book I went into, I'm not going to say with high expectations, but I just thought this was going to be something more than it was. This is a historical fiction about the woman who inspired Hester in the Scarlet Letter. And I think this is another one, talking about books on this list whose concept was great, but whose execution was poor. That is certainly the case here. I think the idea behind this book was really fascinating. And I was really interested in learning about this kind of fictional woman who could have inspired Hester. I think that would have been an interesting book, but the author didn't go far enough with it, in my opinion, because there was a lot in here in conversation with the witch trials, both in Scotland and in Salem, because our main character who inspired Hester, her ancestor was persecuted for witchcraft in Scotland. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote the Scarlet Letter, his ancestor sat as a judge over the Salem witch trials. That is the part of it that I wished had kind of taken over the story a little bit more. I was really into parts of this, but otherwise I found the characterization very poor. I could just tell in some ways that this book was trying to capture the lightning in a bottle feeling of something like Wolf Hall. And I could tell there were lines that we were meant to highlight, lines that we were meant to quote, and they felt very jarring compared to the way the rest of the book was written. And so this was just a perfect storm for me. I didn't enjoy the characters. I didn't enjoy the characterization. I didn't really enjoy the plot. And in a lot of those cases, even when I'm not enjoying that stuff, if the prose is great, I'm probably enjoying the book. But I didn't really enjoy the prose here either. So this was sadly disappointing to me. Again, not a book I would say was bad, but it just did not work for me at all. Okay, let's get into it. The one book on this list that I would actually call bad, that I would really tell you is not a good book, is Hyde by Kiersten White. I am still left scratching my head about this one. This is a book that I went into knowing that most people had hated it this year, but sometimes with controversial books, I can have a good time. Sometimes I wind up liking books that most people tended to review negatively. And so I really did want to take a chance on this because I am a sucker for a game. And I am specifically a sucker for a game to the death, which is what Hyde was sold as. Hyde is like set in an abandoned amusement park where people are competing for money by playing hide and seek there. That is how the book is sold. To me, that's not really what the book is. Everything about this book just spoke to me on a deep level because I truly love stuff like this where you are put into kind of a secluded location and there is a game element and then people start dying. It's just one of my favorite tropes ever. I tend to always enjoy it. Like right now I'm watching Alice in Borderland on Netflix. It's incredible. I mean, really. And that's exactly what the concept of it is. And so I can enjoy anything with this base concept. I'm there to have a good time. Hyde is not necessarily a death game book. And I almost wouldn't even call it a game book at all. The game does not feel very important or imperative at any point to me. And what tends to work for me really well in stories like Hyde is when we automatically have a character that we can get attached to, that we can root for. And that's the strength of a lot of things like The Hunger Games, Squid Game, Alice in Borderland. You automatically imprint on a character. That never once happened for me in Hyde. I didn't feel like I knew the characters very well. One of the major flaws of this book is how short it is. And so I don't feel like enough time was given to the game, nor was enough time given to the characters. A lot of the books on my list, I've said I really enjoyed the idea of. I just think it was poorly executed. In this case, I really don't know what could have been done differently to make me give the book a higher rating. I don't in any way think the book is what it's marketed as, and I think that's a lot of what people's issue has been with it this year. I know this is going to show up on a lot of worst books of 2022, and it's a shame. It really is a shame. But this book is very weird, and it's weird in a way that is unexpected. And I'm not saying I want the book to be spoiled. I'm not saying I want the description of the book to tell me everything about it, you know, but I do really want to know, at least tonally, what the book is trying to be before I pick it up. And Hyde was just bizarre for that, in my opinion. I went into this feeling like I knew what the book was going to be, and then it was nothing like that. And so that was just really disappointing to me. This is my worst book of the year, and I gave it 1 star. But looking at the stack of books that I have here, looking at this list that I put together of disappointing books, this is the only book I regret reading. This is the only book I regret picking up because I do feel like it just wasted my time. I truly do. I feel like at least everything else on this list I got something out of, or I feel like was productive. In this case, I don't feel like I got anything out of Hyde except just a really bad reading experience. And so this was my worst book of the year. I would love to know down below if you have read any of these, and I would love to know like what your controversial opinions are. What were your most disappointing reads of the year? But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.